I was always aware that I wasn't the favorite. Some men have families who treasure them and eagerly await their arrival. I respected them despite our differences. Yet, I was nothing more than a paycheck-carrying ghost in my own home. A provider, and nothing else. My wife and kid would stroll past me in the living room as though I didn't exist. If I spoke to them over supper, they would answer absently, too preoccupied to give me their complete attention. At first, I convinced myself that marriage wasn't a fairy tale, that this was normal. Sometimes, you just had to keep your head down and follow the rules. Fathers weren't always loved, but in my heart, I knew. My wife's voice softened when she spoke to our daughter. They giggled at inside jokes I wasn't part of. I noticed it in the small things, the way they exchanged, knowing glances when I tried to join the conversation. When I gave advice during a family outing, my wife would sigh in frustration, and my daughter would roll her eyes. Every time I inquired about her academic performance, I reassured myself it was just a phase, that perhaps they'd appreciate me, one day. If I worked harder, put in more effort, maybe they'd see my value, but that never happened. Instead, the gap widened. My daughter, who once held my hand on the way to school, grew up to see me as nothing more than an obstacle. My wife, who once whispered that she couldn't imagine life without me, became someone who only acknowledged me to remind me of bills that needed paying. I stayed, even though I was unloved, because that's what men do, right? We bear it, silently. We convince ourselves that love is defined by accountability, consistency, by showing up, even when no one wants us there. I went to work, came home, and tried. I asked my daughter about her day, even though she never asked about mine. I kissed my wife's forehead, even though she pulled away. I made breakfast on weekends, bought birthday presents, and kept trying to close a gap that only I seemed to notice. And yet, when something went wrong, I was always the problem. If my daughter failed an exam, I had distracted her. If my wife had a bad day, I hadn't comforted her enough. If the bills were higher than expected, I wasn't handling the money well. I kept telling myself that one day they'd realize. One day they'd see that I was the one constant in their lives. But that day never came. It started like any other night. I came home from work, exhausted, expecting nothing more than a cold meal and a strained conversation. I wasn't even looking for gratitude anymore. I had given up on that long ago. All I wanted was peace, but there was never any peace in that house. The air was thick with tension as soon as I stepped inside. My wife and daughter barely acknowledged my presence as usual. But this time, something was different. I set my briefcase down, took a deep breath, and walked into the living room. My wife sat on the couch, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. My daughter sat with her head down, her entire body radiating anger. I had seen this before. I knew what was coming. I kept my voice even. "What's going on?" A pause. Then my wife turned to me, her face filled with bitterness. "Do you know what your daughter did today?" Her tone was sharp, accusatory. I looked at my daughter, who pressed her lips into a tight, cruel line. "She failed her class," I said, keeping my voice calm. My wife's face twisted with irritation, as if it were somehow my fault. My daughter scoffed and glared at me. "You don't care, do you? You've never cared." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. "I was trying," she continued. "I was under so much pressure, and instead of helping me, you just—" I exhaled slowly, feeling something inside me crack. Not from anger, but from sheer exhaustion. "I worked late to pay for your tutors," I said evenly. "I asked about your well-being. I gave you space when you didn't want to talk. And somehow, that's what caused your grades to drop?" My wife's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. My daughter looked away. In that moment, I realized the truth. She didn't love me, not as a father. I had spent years denying it, but now I couldn't anymore. To her, I was just an inconvenience, just like her mother saw me. When things went wrong, I was the easiest thing to blame. I looked at my wife. She wasn't even pretending to care. Then my daughter spat out the words that sealed it. "You've ruined our lives." I swallowed the pain and opened my mouth to reply, but my wife cut in, her voice cool and indifferent. "We're happier without you." The words didn't even shock me. Maybe because I had been waiting for them for years. Maybe because, deep down, I had always known. There was no fixing this. No amount of silent endurance or sacrifice would change. The fact that I didn't belong in my own family. I didn't yell. I didn't beg for explanations or second chances. I just turned away. I packed a bag, grabbed some clothes, my wallet, my phone. I took one last look at the walls that had witnessed my years of solitude. And then I left. No one stopped me. No one called out for me to stay. No one even noticed. The night air was cold, but I barely felt it. I had no plan, no destination. I had spent years ensuring my family had everything they needed, never once preparing for this moment. I checked my wallet. A few bills, my ID, some credit cards. Enough to last a few days. That was all I had to show for years of sacrifice. I walked until I found a cheap roadside motel. The clerk barely glanced at me as he slid the room key across the counter. No questions, no pity, just business. The room was small, dimly lit, a single bed, a desk with a flickering lamp. I dropped my bag and sat on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. No arguments. No accusations. No passive-aggressive sighs. Just silence. And for the first time, I didn't know how to feel. My phone buzzed. For a brief moment, I wondered if it was them. Maybe my wife had realized the truth. Maybe my daughter regretted her words. I looked at the screen, a bank notification. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course, they weren't thinking about me. They weren't wondering where I was. They weren't expecting me to come back. It was over, and it should have hurt. But instead, it just confirmed what I had known all along. I had never truly been part of that family. I had only ever been a convenient target. For the first time in years, I laid back, closed my eyes, and let out a breath. Tomorrow I had no home, no plan, no one to turn to. But I wasn't lost, because for the first time, I was free. Ignoring it, I looked at my phone, my thumb lingering over the screen before placing it down. If they had desired my presence in their life, they would have contacted me sooner rather than later. If they had experienced even a fraction of the suffering I endured when they told me I was better off gone, they would have missed me. They would have called earlier today, but I chose to ignore it. I got up, showered, and after getting ready, my phone vibrated 4 more times before I exited my room. I took a cup of coffee from the small kitchen without checking my phone and gave Rai a nod. I left for work after watching TV on the couch, and by the time my shift was over, I had 31 missed calls, including 11 from my mother. I should have ignored it again when my daughter, 14, called 6 times from an unknown number. I wanted to disregard it, but something made me wonder, what if it was real? What if something had happened I knew, deep down, it was a lie? But I didn't care. Whatever was going on in that house wasn't my problem anymore. Still, I chose to respond. I sat in the conference room and gazed at my vibrating phone. Another call rang in my palm. I let it ring. Then, against my better judgment, I answered. "Hi!" A quick breath came from the other end, followed by a familiar voice. "Sweetheart?" She hadn't called me that in years. "Please, we need to talk, my love." Grabbing the phone, I inquired in a neutral tone. "What's going on?" There was a shaky breath. Then, after a moment, "We've fallen on hard times." My mother acknowledged that my sister had been struggling academically and financially. I cut her off. When she hesitated, I laughed sarcastically. "We need help." Naturally, they did. There was a pause on the other end and then barely a whisper. "We require money." I should have anticipated this. A mixture of satisfaction and anger settled in my chest. I realized that my mother would only reach out if she needed something. And yet, even knowing this didn't stop the rage from building. They had cast me out as if I were nothing. They had told me I was a burden that had ruined their lives, yet here they were. Not crawling back because they missed me, not because they were sorry, but because they needed my help. "I know we've never been there for you the way we should have," my mother said, her voice breaking. "But please, we're struggling, and we need you." I realize we made mistakes. I let the silence linger. I inhaled through my nose. "Is it just the two of you?" I wanted her to experience the weight of uncertainty, to feel what it was like to wonder if the person on the other end of the line genuinely cared. Like I had felt the night I left. Like I had felt for years. When I finally spoke, the breaks in their voices told me they thought I cared. My mother let out a small gasp, as if it were shocking that I wouldn't immediately save them. "Please, try to understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We acknowledge our mistakes, but we're still your family." "No!" I interrupted, my voice cold. "You were my family, past tense." She sucked in a breath, but before she could reply, another voice came through. "My daughter. My father. Please." His voice was hoarse, weak. "I know I was awful to you, but I need your help. Just for a little while." For a moment, something stirred within me. Not guilt, not pity, something else. Then I remembered. I remembered the way my mother had blamed me for everything, the way my father had rolled his eyes whenever I spoke, the way she had screamed in my face, "You ruined our lives!" I clenched my teeth. "I needed you both," I said softly, "and you weren't there. I know—" "No," I interrupted them again, steel in my voice. "You didn't want me, Dad. You should have thought of this before you threw me away." He was silent. I had nothing left to offer them. I ended the call. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it. Then I turned it off completely and leaned back in my chair. I exhaled slowly, my hands clenched into fists. But beneath the rage, beneath the years of bitterness, I felt something else. Relief. For the first time, they needed me, and I wasn't going to make their lives easier.